do have comments, just send them to me and we'll incorporate them into the minutes. I am very glad that we have Kristin Fitzgerald and Brian
Knieser.
Thank you very much. I have some information about Kristin. So about 4 years ago, she gave a presentation when this rule was proposed. At the time, she said she had been with the agency for 14 years. So now that would be 18 years. She said she started working on RCRA 29 years ago, or 25, which would be 29 today. She was a consultant to the EPA and Department of Energy, conducted research on the effects of elevated carbon dioxide in wetland plants. She holds a BA in government from St. Lawrence University in New York and an MS in environmental science and policy from George Mason University in Virginia. Sorry, Brian, I don't have anything on you, so you probably have as excellent of qualifications as Kristin does, I would surmise. And with that...
Sorry, I didn't know if you wanted me to go through that. I'll just say that I have, I think, about 17 years of your experience, something like that.
With that, I take it away, and we'll have a little bit at the end, I assume, for a Q&A?
Yes. Yeah, so
okay.
Our plan is to go maybe about 40 plus minutes of speaking, and then we can do the rest in Q&A.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to start us off. This is Kristin Fitzgerald, and thank you very much to Mark for inviting us to speak today about this new RCRA final rule for managing hazardous waste pharmaceuticals at healthcare facilities and reverse distributors. So as Mark just mentioned, we spoke to you about 4 years ago about the proposed rule. So hopefully, some of this will ring some bells. I know it's been a few years, but hopefully it won't be completely foreign. And hopefully also, you speak some RCRA. So it's hard to do, kind of an introduction to a new RCRA rule and also do RCRA 101 all in 45 minutes. So hopefully, you're familiar enough with RCRA that we're not speaking total gibberish here. So our working assumption, kind of as we prepared for today, is that your customers are VSQGs under RCRA, very small. They used to be known as conditionally exempt small quantity generators. The Generator Improvement Rule in 2016 renamed them the very small quantity generators, or VSQGs. So we're assuming that the folks that you're typically going to be working with would be VSQGs under RCRA. So our focus today will be to, give you an overview of the rule, but then when we drill down on the various provisions of the rule, we'll just pick out the portions of the rule that we think would be of interest to VSQGs. So with that, very brief introduction, I'm going to hand it over to Brian. He'll start us off, and then I'll do the second half of the presentation.
All right, thanks, Kristin. All right, so this is a hazardous waste rule that deals specifically with pharmaceuticals that are generated within the healthcare industry. The rule was published in the Federal Register on February 22nd of this year, and there is the citation. If you want to look up the full text of the rule, you can just Google the citation, or you can just go to the EPA webpage for the pharmaceuticals rule, and you can just search for hazardous waste pharmaceuticals rule, and we'll have a link to the Federal Register on our page. So in this version of our presentation, which we've given quite a few times now, we've given the presentation quite a few times, we tailored this version to this audience, and we wanted to focus on issues that we thought would be of particular interest to healthcare facilities that are VSQGs. And so with that in mind, we're going to go over some of the broader concepts of the rules. So pharmaceuticals that are considered hazardous waste, which ones those are, the amendment to the nicotine listing, and give you an overview of Part 266 Subpart P. Then we're going to get into the more detailed aspects that we thought would be helpful to this audience. Kristin's going to get into that, and so those are going to be the sewer ban, applicability and counting, which is pretty much tells you who is and who isn't subject to the rule in the first place, and then we're going to go over the VSQG healthcare facility regs. So let's start off talking about effective dates. So the effective date of both parts of the rule, Subpart P and the nicotine amendment, is August 21st, which is also known as tomorrow. Kind of snuck up on us. So apparently I heard somebody else say that we're on the eve of the effective date, which I like the way that sounds. So the rule will be in effect anywhere that EPA implements the hazardous waste program. So all parts of the rule will be in effect in non-authorized states. But those are only Iowa and Alaska, Indian country, and territories tomorrow. For authorized states, Subpart P and the nicotine amendment, they won't be effective until the states adopt those parts of the rule. But the difference between the two is that authorized states do have to adopt Subpart P, but they are not required to adopt the nicotine amendment. But we actually have gotten some feedback from states, and it sounds like most of them are on board with the nicotine amendment. So we're assuming that a lot, if not most, will eventually end up picking up the nicotine amendment. But just to reiterate, authorized states, they have to adopt before the rule goes into effect. Non-authorized states, all parts of the rule will be in effect tomorrow. And just to give you a little bit of kind of not that insider information, Florida, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, they're all authorized states, but the rule will also be in effect in those states tomorrow. And South Dakota has told us that they have adopted the rule as well, and so it'll be in effect in South Dakota on the 3rd of September. So that's 6 states so far, 5 as of tomorrow. So let's talk about what pharmaceuticals are hazardous waste. So there, unfortunately, is no free definitive list of which pharmaceuticals are hazardous waste when they're discarded. Some waste disposal companies have that information, but it's something you got to pay for. It's a service they offer. There are some online resources that will help you determine whether the pharmaceutical waste that you generate is considered hazardous, but ultimately the responsibility of making an accurate hazardous waste determination lies with the generator. So that first link is a link to a wiki page that we used to sponsor. It's actually an archive of the page. The site ended up shutting down. The hosting company went out of business. But we were able to download and archive that information, and we've made that available. And I just want to reiterate that, or kind of emphasize that if you go to that website, it's user-generated information. It's not complete, and it doesn't actually constitute official EPA policy. And then there are another couple links to the HER Center, the Hazardous Environmental Resource Center. And they have some information on how to make determinations, and they have some lists of hazardous waste pharmaceuticals, as do the Florida and Colorado websites that we've linked as well. So let's talk about some examples of listed hazardous waste pharmaceuticals. So these are wastes that meet either the acute or non-acute list, so either the P or U list. There are some common examples that you might see. So for the P-listed acute hazardous waste, these are pharmaceuticals that you only have to generate a little bit over 2 pounds per month to be considered a large quantity generator. So these are, it's pretty important to keep an eye on these ones. And some examples are warfarin, arsenic trioxide, nicotine. We probably should be an asterisk next to nicotine because, as I'll get into a little bit later, we've actually modified the PO75 listing to take out nicotine patches, gums, and lozenges. And then you have the non-acute list, and the thresholds are a lot higher to bump up into the next generator category, but still worth mentioning some of the common ones. You can see them there. I'm not going to go through them one by one. So this slide talks about examples of characteristic wastes that are considered characteristic. So these are pharmaceutical wastes that exhibit a hazardous waste characteristic. And to start with, a lot of pharmaceuticals that are in alcohol preparations meet the ignitability characteristic, and that means that they have flash points that are less than 140 degrees Fahrenheit, for example. There's more to determining ignitability, but that just gives you an idea of what ignitable means. Some are also considered toxic, and that they're toxic if they have certain constituents present above specific concentrations when going through the T-clip test. And some examples are chromium. That's actually non-prescription. That's a vitamin or a supplement. There's M-cresol, mercury. Those are both preservatives. Selenium is another vitamin and or supplement, also non-prescription, and then burn creams. So again, that gives you an idea of some of the pharmaceuticals that are considered hazardous, but it's not a complete list, and we don't have any complete list that we can, offer to folks from our end. And again, it's just the responsibility is on the generator to actually make that accurate hazardous waste determination. So we're going to move on to talking about the nicotine amendment. So why did we modify the nicotine listing? Like I mentioned, nicotine is considered an acute hazardous waste when it's discarded, so you don't really have to generate very much of it to bump up into the LQG generator category. And we found that there were a lot of healthcare facilities or retail pharmacies in particular that were bumping up into the LQG category just because of their nicotine replacement therapy waste. So in the proposed rule, we asked for comments about whether we should modify the PO75 listing, considered the comments that we got, did our own literature review, and ultimately concluded that patches, gums, and lozenges do not meet the regulatory criteria for acute hazardous waste. So what we did is we modified the PO75 listing to take out FDA-approved over-the-counter nicotine replacement therapies. And so that means that patches, gums, and lozenges, but just those three types of items, nicotine, patches, gums, and lozenges, can now be discarded as non-hazardous waste, but only in states that have adopted the nicotine amendment. So even though we modified the PO75 listing, nicotine is still an acute hazardous waste. So that means that other formulations that have nicotine in it will still be considered PO75 when discarded. Some pharmaceuticals that are still PO75 are e-liquids and e-cigarettes and prescription nicotine drugs. Those would have to be managed under Subpart P. There are also some other non-pharmaceutical nicotine wastes like pesticides and nicotine that's used in research and manufacturing. Those have to be managed under the standard 262 generator regulations. So we're going to go over now an overview of Subpart P. So Subpart P is located in 40 CFR Part 266, and that's as opposed to the standard generator regulations, quote unquote standard, which are in Part 262. So when you hear us talk about Subpart P, it's actually in 266 and which is separate from the Part 262 generator regulations. So Subpart P is a waste-specific and a sector-specific rule. It's waste-specific because it regulates the management of hazardous waste pharmaceuticals, and it's sector-specific because it regulates healthcare facilities and reverse distributors. And so the thing is that these wastes are already regulated under RCRA. So we're not saying that things that used to be considered non-hazardous are now considered hazardous. What we're doing is we're changing how these things that were already considered RCRA hazardous waste, how they're regulated in the future. And because of the complexities and the compliance challenges in the healthcare industry, our goal was to create a set of regulations that's a better fit for the management of hazardous waste pharmaceuticals at healthcare facilities and reverse distributors. So going back to the idea of the waste-specific, sector-specific thing for a minute, this will hopefully give you a better idea of when and where Subpart P applies. So that top row on this table, those are the types of waste, and on the left column is the types of facilities. So if you're a healthcare facility who generates hazardous waste pharmaceuticals, you are regulated, and the waste is regulated under Subpart P. For healthcare facilities that generate other hazardous waste that is not a hazardous waste pharmaceutical, all the other RCRA regulations apply, but just not Subpart P. So if you're a facility that is not a healthcare facility, you might still generate what would meet the definition of a hazardous waste pharmaceutical, but because you're not a healthcare facility or a reverse distributor, that waste is regulated under the standard Part 262 generator regulations, as is all the other hazardous waste that you generate. So basically the gist is if you're not a healthcare facility, there's no chance that you're going to be subject to Subpart P. And even for healthcare facilities and reverse distributors, only the pharmaceutical waste that they generate is regulated under Subpart P. All right, so even though this rule only applies to hazardous waste pharmaceuticals, we are encouraging healthcare facilities to manage all of their pharmaceutical waste under Subpart P, and that way, that waste is guaranteed to be kept out of sewers and municipal waste landfills, because sewering and landfill leachate is increasingly thought to be a source of pharmaceuticals in ground and surface water. So that's one of the environmental benefits. Some of the benefits to healthcare facilities to managing all of their waste under subpart, their pharmaceutical waste under subpart P. To start with, there's less training that's required because, if you don't have to train personnel on how to make individual hazardous waste determinations, there's less training required for that, if you're managing everything as hazardous. There are fewer containers that would probably be necessary around a healthcare facility because we're allowing healthcare facilities to commingle hazardous and non-hazardous waste pharmaceuticals. And healthcare facilities also don't have to worry about bumping up in generator category every month because there are no generator categories under subpart P. And that also means that you don't have to count the hazardous waste pharmaceuticals every month or report the amount of hazardous waste pharmaceuticals that you're generating if you're operating under subpart P. That's a crucial if. All right, so now we're going to get into the framework of subpart P, and the next slides, a couple of slides are going to include some definitions and diagrams, and the idea here is to give you a sense of how it works as a system. So hazardous waste pharmaceuticals that are regulated under subpart P, how they're regulated, depends on two things. So first, it depends on who is managing the hazardous waste pharmaceuticals. Are they a healthcare facility or a reverse distributor? And two, where the hazardous waste pharmaceuticals are headed when they leave a healthcare facility. So if they're going directly to a TSDF for disposal, or if they're going indirectly to a TSDF via a reverse distributor so that the healthcare facility can obtain manufacturer's credit. All right, so there are three types of hazardous waste pharmaceuticals that we've defined in the rule. You have non-creditable and potentially creditable hazardous waste pharmaceuticals. Those are both generated at a healthcare facility. And then there are evaluated hazardous waste pharmaceuticals, and those come from a reverse distributor. So we're just going to go over the definitions kind of in terms of like the reverse flow from the healthcare facility to the TSDF. So I'm going to start off with non-creditable. So these are wastes that are both prescription and non-prescription. And these are items that have no reasonable expectation of receiving manufacturer's credit. So they might be broken or leaking, dispensed to a patient, expired for more than a year. These are things that a healthcare facility can easily tell that they don't have a potential to receive manufacturer's credit. For potentially creditable, these are prescription-only wastes that do have a reasonable expectation of receiving manufacturer's credit. So these are wastes at the healthcare facility, but we're allowing them to go to a reverse distributor to see if they or to be evaluated for manufacturer's credit. So these things are typically in original manufacturer packaging, they're undispensed and unexpired or expired for less than a year. And then finally you have evaluated. So these are items that require no further evaluation or verification of manufacturer's credit, and the next stop is the TSDF. So they're going straight from a reverse distributor to the TSDF for disposal. So the type of hazardous waste pharmaceutical that you're dealing with, that determines what regulations apply at the healthcare facility or the reverse distributor. And there's a lot here. There's a lot of details to go over here, so I'm not going to get into those one by one. Just going to kind of give you a general idea. So the standards for healthcare facilities that are managing non-creditable hazardous waste pharmaceuticals are based on the universal waste regulations, plus a couple of extra requirements like container security and the use of the manifest. For healthcare facilities that manage potentially creditable hazardous waste pharmaceuticals, we're not really requiring much. We're just requiring tracking and common carriers like UPS, USPS, FedEx. Those are allowed. And then for reverse distributors that are managing evaluated hazardous waste pharmaceuticals, those standards for the reverse distributors are based on the 262 large quantity generator requirements, again with a couple extra requirements. And before I turn it over to Kristin, I'm just going to go over quickly the new empty container standards. So in the final rule, we changed the standards for what is considered RCRA empty for containers that held hazardous waste pharmaceuticals. So before the rule, containers that held acute hazardous waste pharmaceuticals had to be managed, the containers themselves had to be managed as hazardous waste unless they were RCRA empty, and that was pretty burdensome on healthcare facilities. It was hard for them to comply with in the first place, especially for things like syringes. So what we did is in the final rule, we said that containers that held hazardous waste pharmaceuticals are not hazardous waste if the contents were removed by practices commonly employed to remove the material. So that means that for stock bottles or dispensing bottles, unit dose containers, all you got to do is remove the contents by practices commonly employed, like dispensing them. For syringes, they're considered empty if the plunger is fully depressed, and for IV bags, they're considered empty if they're fully administered. So the only catch here is for what we're calling other containers. So this is kind of a container-specific standard that we've finalized. So if it's not one of those first three types, if the container is not one of those first three types of containers, if it's an other, what we would consider an other container, then that can't be rendered RCRA empty and has to be managed as hazardous waste. So some examples might be, and one example would be like a tube of ointment, because you can't rinse them out. You can't see if it's empty. And actually, I'll mention real quick that triple rinsing to render a container that held hazardous waste, acute hazardous waste pharmaceuticals, triple rinsing is not allowed to render that container empty. And that's because, you know, we want to make sure that people aren't rinsing containers that held hazardous waste pharmaceuticals and then pouring that rinsate down the drain. So that's kind of in keeping with the sewering prohibition. And with that, I will turn it over to Kristin to talk about Subpart B.
Okay, thanks, Brian. So I know there's a lot to cover here in a short amount of time. Hopefully you're following along with us here, and Brian's, you know, given us a pretty good big picture of Subpart P, kind of the overview, and I like those diagrams, the schematics and stuff so you can kind of visualize what we're talking about. So he's provided this big picture of Subpart P, and now I'm going to dive into 3 specific provisions of Subpart P that we think are of interest to VSQGs. So Brian's already mentioned this a couple of times, the sewer prohibition. So under the new final rule, hazardous waste pharmaceuticals can no longer be sewered. So, you know, sewered is probably a made-up word in this rule. So just to be clear, when we say they can't be sewered, you can't put them down the drain and you can't flush them any longer. So we're hoping, based on our estimates, that this will prevent about 1,600 to 2,300 tons of hazardous waste pharmaceuticals from being sewered annually. So the sewer prohibition in the final rule applies to all healthcare facilities, and this is one of the few provisions that also applies to VSQG healthcare facilities. It also applies to all reverse distributors. It also applies to hazardous waste that are also DEA controlled substances. So there's really no well, I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit, but there's not, we tried to not to include any exceptions to the sewer ban in the regulation. And although the rule technically only applies to hazardous waste pharmaceuticals at healthcare facilities and reverse distributors, we strongly discourage the sewering of any pharmaceutical by any entity. And as Brian mentioned, the sewer prohibition will be effective in all states tomorrow, regardless of whether the state is authorized to implement RCRA and regardless of whether the state has adopted Subpart P. This is the one provision in the rule that's known as a HCFS provision. HCFS is the Hazardous and Solid Waste Amendments from 1984. So anything that's promulgated pursuant to HCFS becomes effective in all states on the federal effective date. And so this is one of the few provisions that applies to VSQGs, and it's the only provision that's HCFS provision, so it's effective in all states tomorrow. So we've developed a series of about a dozen FAQs for our website. And don't worry, we're not going to go over all those FAQs today. We're just going to go over 3 ones that we're getting quite a bit. So the first one being, as I said, I was getting ahead of myself a little bit earlier. So, okay, so you just said that EPA strongly discourages the sewering of any pharmaceutical by any entity. Are there any exceptions to this recommendation? And the answer is, in the regulations, there actually are no exceptions, right? The regulations themselves apply to all hazardous waste pharmaceuticals at healthcare facilities and reverse distributors. But beyond the regulatory ban, there's that recommendation that we strongly discourage the sewering of any pharmaceutical by any entity. And that's where there are a few exceptions to that recommendation. So for healthcare facilities, you know, they've got some things that are pretty benign, you know, sterile water, saline, lactated ringers. So we would be fine with the sewering of those. And then at households, there's something called the FDA flush list. The flush list is a set of pharmaceuticals that are lethal at low doses. So when the manufacturers apply for, you know, for their approval of the drug, and they make a recommendation to FDA on how things should be disposed. In some cases, when they're lethal at low doses, they'll recommend that they be flushed, and FDA puts that, allows the manufacturer to put that in their insert. So the FDA, that flush list is only for households, and the origins of that is for households with pets or small children, so that those pets or small children won't have access to those drugs that can be lethal at low doses. But the primary recommendation for those, for households, to get rid of those would be to use take-back receptacles at pharmacies, or mail-back envelopes that they can use in their own homes. So that would be the primary recommendation, is to use take-back options if at all possible. But if take-back options aren't available, then go ahead and flush those few drugs. But again, the genesis of this recommendation for the flush list by the FDA is to prevent pets and small children from accessing them. So, you know, if you're in a household that doesn't have that problem, we would discourage the flushing. Yeah, so the second question about the sewer ban would be, you know, the way the regulatory language is written, it says the sewer prohibition says that healthcare facilities and reverse distributors are prohibited from discharging hazardous waste pharmaceuticals to a sewer system that passes through to a publicly owned treatment works, which is usually referred to as a POTW. The question would be, does that mean that hazardous waste pharmaceuticals can be discharged to other sewer systems that discharge to septic system or privately owned treatment works or federally owned treatment works? Now, I'm going to say that the short answer to this question is quite easy. It's no. The longer answer to this question is a little bit more complicated. So in 1980, we created what's known as the RCRA domestic sewage exclusion. There's two parts of it, and the second half of that domestic sewage exclusion excludes from the definition of solid waste any mixture of domestic sewage and other waste that passes through a sewer system to a publicly owned treatment works. Okay, so only the discharges and mixtures of domestic sewage and hazardous waste to publicly owned treatment works were excluded from the regulatory definition of solid waste. Okay, so it's pretty narrow, right? That exemption that's been in the regs in 261.4. Therefore, discharges of hazardous waste, including hazardous waste pharmaceuticals to septic tanks, privately owned treatment works, and federally owned treatment works are considered solid waste and therefore not allowed. I mean, unless you want to manage your septic tank as a hazardous waste management unit. Okay, so the third and final FAQ that we'll go over is related to DEA regs. So DEA does not allow the sewering of excess inventory of controlled substances, but DEA does allow the sewering of pharmaceutical wastage. So does EPA allow the sewering of pharmaceutical wastage? So before we answer that question, actually, I'm going to ask another one, which is, what the heck is pharmaceutical wastage? And that is a term that DEA uses to refer to drugs that have been dispensed but not administered. So think in terms of maybe a leftover pre-filled syringe, and only partial dose was needed for the patient, and now you've got a syringe with half a dose left over in it. That half a dose left over in the syringe would be, DEA would refer to that as pharmaceutical wastage. Okay, so now that we know what pharmaceutical wastage is, does the EPA allow the sewering of pharmaceutical wastage? And again, the answer is no. If it's a hazardous waste pharmaceutical at a healthcare facility or reverse distributor, they're all prohibited from being sewered, including pharmaceutical wastage and including hazardous waste pharmaceuticals that are also DEA-controlled substances. We wanted to be consistent in our messaging about hazardous waste pharmaceuticals not going down the drain. So the second issue that I'll be covering is basically determining when a healthcare facility is in fact subject to Subpart P. So before we dive into that, I just want to back up a little bit and say that, you know, Subpart P, Part 266 Subpart P is considered more stringent than the current existing regulations. And why does that matter? It affects a couple of things. It means that it's not optional. It's not optional for the states to adopt Subpart P, and it's also not optional for healthcare facilities and reverse distributors to comply with Subpart P. So therefore, hazardous waste pharmaceuticals must be managed under Subpart P by all reverse distributors and then all healthcare facilities that generate above VSQG amounts of hazardous waste. So we estimate approximately, you know, somewhere over 80% of healthcare facilities are VSQGs. So it's important to know how Subpart P will affect them. So how do you know if a healthcare facility is subject to Subpart P? We're going to look at two scenarios. In both cases, in both scenarios, you're going to start by counting all the hazardous waste that's generated per month at that facility, including the hazardous waste pharmaceuticals. So in the first scenario, if that healthcare facility generates below all the monthly VSQG amounts of hazardous waste, which are listed here, you know, below the 2.2 pounds of acute hazardous waste and the 220 pounds of non-acute hazardous waste and the 220 pounds of cleanup from spill of acute hazardous waste, you got to be, if you're below all those thresholds, then the healthcare facility is, let's say, mostly not subject to Subpart P. You know, because this is RCRA, there's an exception to everything, right? So mostly healthcare facilities that are VSQGs would not be subject to Subpart P, but VSQG healthcare facilities are subject to the sewer ban and the empty container standards. Okay, so if they're not subject to Subpart P, they'd be subject to basically the existing regulations for VSQGs under Part 262 for all of its hazardous waste. Now, those regulations used to be in 261.5, but the Generator Improvement Rule in 2016 moved those regulations into 262, and now they have their own section there in 262.14. So the second scenario kind of start the same way. We're going to count all our hazardous waste generated per month, including the hazardous waste pharmaceuticals. Now, in this scenario, if you generate above any amount, any of the monthly VSQG amounts of hazardous waste, then the healthcare facility is subject to Subpart P for its hazardous waste pharmaceuticals. And the healthcare is a VSQG, SQG, or an LQG under Part 262 for its other hazardous waste. So now by going above any of those VSQG thresholds, that bumps you into Subpart P for management of your hazardous waste pharmaceuticals, while your other hazardous waste remain subject to, you know, 262, the traditional RCRA regulations. Okay, so then when we take those two scenarios and then we add in the three generator categories here, we kind of get four possible combinations of status for healthcare facilities. And we've given those various things kind of nicknames. You won't see these nicknames in the regulations, so some of them do appear in the preamble to the final rule. But let's take that first one, what we refer to as full VSQGs. So these guys are below the thresholds for all of the VSQG thresholds, right? They're below the acute, the non-acute, and the cleanup of acute, excuse the spill cleanup material from acute spill. So those we refer to as full VSQGs. They're basically not subject to Subpart P except for the sewer ban, the empty container standards, and then what we'll talk about in the next section, optional provisions. And they're subject to the VSQG regs in Part 262 for their other hazardous waste. So they're VSQGs all the way across the board, full VSQGs. But if you go to the second, third, and fourth lines on there, if you exceed any of the VSQG thresholds, then you're subject to Subpart P for your hazardous waste pharmaceuticals. And then over the far right-hand column, you'll also be either a VSQG, SQG, or LQG for your other hazardous waste. So we refer to those as, Subpart P VSQGs because they're subject to Subpart P for their hazardous waste pharmaceuticals, but they're VSQGs for their other hazardous waste. So we've got the full VSQGs versus the Subpart P VSQGs. So once you've gone through all that, if you do figure out that you are in fact subject to Subpart P, as I think we mentioned earlier, there are no generator categories under Subpart P when it comes to hazardous waste pharmaceuticals. So that means, all healthcare facilities are going to be regulated the same for their hazardous waste pharmaceuticals, and all reverse distributors are regulated the same for their hazardous waste pharmaceuticals. So, the benefit of that is that the healthcare facilities and reverse distributors that are operating under Subpart P don't have to keep track of how much hazardous waste pharmaceuticals they're generating on a monthly basis. And they don't have to segregate their acute and their non-acute because they don't, once they're under Subpart P, it doesn't matter anymore. So we're hoping that this will provide an incentive to overmanage those non-hazardous waste pharmaceuticals as hazardous without having to worry about bumping up in that generator category and incurring additional regulations. So, under Part 262, the more hazardous waste you generate, that equals more regulations. But under Subpart P, if you generate more hazardous waste pharmaceuticals, it doesn't equal more regulations. So hopefully that will encourage people to overmanage the non-hazardous pharmaceuticals as hazardous. So the final provision I'm going to be talking about are those provisions that they're optional for VSQG healthcare facilities. So we already went over some of this, but if you're like me, you will benefit from the repetition. So just to build up to the optional provisions here. Healthcare facilities that are Subpart P VSQGs, right, are subject to all provisions of Subpart P for their hazardous waste pharmaceuticals, right? They're subject to both Subpart P for their hazardous waste pharmaceuticals and then their VSQGs for their other hazardous waste. But if you're a healthcare facility that's a full VSQG, you're not subject to Subpart P. Of course, there's exceptions. Those exceptions are the sewer ban and the empty container provisions. But we built a couple of things into Subpart P for those full VSQGs that are kind of unique. And one is that those full VSQGs can opt into Subpart P and comply with all the provisions of Subpart P, or they can continue to operate under kind of the standard RCRA generator regulations under Part 262 and use the optional provisions that were created under Subpart P. Now, if a healthcare facility decides to use some of these optional provisions, that does not constitute opting in and does not require notification to EPA about using those. So this section of the presentation is going to discuss those optional provisions that VSQGs can use if they choose not to opt in. Okay, so there's 4 of them. The first one is that a VSQG healthcare facility can continue to send their potentially creditable hazardous waste pharmaceuticals to a reverse distributor. So under the current VSQG regulations, a VSQG can only send its hazardous waste to a list of specified types of facilities. So we added to that list of facilities and said, we added reverse distributors to that list of types of facilities to which healthcare facilities can send its hazardous waste. But they can't send any of their hazardous waste or all of their hazardous waste there. It's limited. The healthcare facility that's a VSQG can only send their potentially creditable hazardous waste pharmaceuticals to a reverse distributor. A reverse distributor is this kind of new hazardous waste management facility under the regulations that can accept waste from off-site from generators, from multiple generators, but the only type of hazardous waste pharmaceuticals or hazardous waste that they can accept are these potentially creditable hazardous waste pharmaceuticals that have potential for getting manufacturer credit. So they have this value associated with them. Okay, so that's the only type of waste that a VSQG can send to a reverse distributor. For that matter, it's the only waste any healthcare facility can send to a reverse distributor. So the VSQG can't send their other hazardous waste to a reverse distributor. Likewise, a VSQG is not required to use a reverse distributor. It's just that they're allowed to use a reverse distributor. Okay, so the second optional provision is off-site consolidation. So a very small quantity generator healthcare facility can send its hazardous waste pharmaceuticals off-site to another healthcare facility, but the receiving healthcare facility has to follow some conditions. And there's two sets of conditions that they can choose from. There's a new set of conditions that we created under Subpart P, or there's an existing set of conditions that we added in 2016 as part of the generator improvements rule. So we kind of created this, option to allow for maximum flexibility, but they're similar but different conditions under the two sets of regulations. So why would we include or create this offsite consolidation provision? We've done it twice now, not just in the generator improvements rule, but now we've replicated under Subpart P. Why would we do that? So the answer is that federally, VSQGs can put their hazardous waste in basically the trash in the municipal solid waste stream. But some VSQGs have approached us over the years and said, but we would actually prefer to return our hazardous waste pharmaceuticals to our supplier, and they would manage them as hazardous waste. The VSQG can't necessarily afford to have a vendor come out and collect from each VSQG site. But if you allow us to consolidate them, then they'll get managed as hazardous waste. And we concur. We would prefer this practice as well, because then it's diverting hazardous waste pharmaceuticals from the municipal waste stream into proper hazardous waste management. But the problem was that the previous regulations didn't allow a VSQG to send its hazardous waste offsite to another generator. There was no regulatory mechanism for that. So basically, with the generator improvements rule and now Subpart P, we've created this regulatory mechanism to allow VSQGs to manage their hazardous waste in this environmentally preferable way. So under Subpart P, the offsite consolidation was designed to accommodate existing practices in two common situations. One is with a military base that has small nearby off-post clinics. And the second situation is long-term care facilities that get their pharmaceuticals supplied to them by something known as long-term care pharmacies. So we created it with those in mind, but the offsite consolidation under Subpart P is not limited to those two situations. It can be used in other situations provided the conditions are met. So there are two sets of conditions. Like I said, you can either do the Subpart P offsite consolidation conditions, or you can do the generator improvement rule consolidation conditions. Now, I'm not going to go over them in detail here, but I did include these slides for your reference. So these are the conditions for Subpart P. There's conditions for the receiving healthcare facility. Note that the receiving healthcare facility in this case does not have to be a large quantity generator. We considered it, but remember Subpart P doesn't have generator category, so it really wouldn't have worked very well. And then the conditions are a little bit different under the generator improvements rule, offsite consolidation. There's conditions on the VSQG as well as the receiving healthcare facility, and they're a little bit more specific and narrow. So then I kind of put them side by side, the two types of consolidation, and we don't need to get into the details here so much. I think kind of the takeaway here is that I would consider the generator improvement rule offsite consolidation to have more conditions and more limitations on it. However, on the other hand, it creates a little bit more flexibility. So if you are a healthcare facility, a VSQG healthcare facility, we would expect you to choose the generator improvements rule offsite consolidation, because it allows you, if you have both hazardous waste pharmaceuticals and other hazardous waste together that you want to consolidate offsite, right? So if you have more than just hazardous waste pharmaceuticals that you want to consolidate offsite, you're going to have to use the generator improvements rule offsite consolidation. But if you're only going to consolidate the hazardous waste pharmaceuticals offsite, then you're going to go with the Subpart P consolidation, in my estimation, right? That would be the more logical thing to do, because the generator improvements rule 1 is a little bit more stringent. Okay, so the next 2 optional provisions for VSQGs are only for long-term care facilities. So long-term care facility that is a VSQG, we are now allowing to dispose of its hazardous waste pharmaceuticals in an on-site collection receptacle that complies with the DEA regulations. Okay, so that leads to, what the heck is an on-site collection receptacle? So there's a whole set of DEA regulations for take-backs pharmaceuticals. And the DEA regulations allow retail stores that are already DEA registrants to amend their DEA registration to become what's known as collectors. And those collectors can put take-back collection receptacles in their stores, or a retail store can put it in a long-term care facility. And that's intended to collect ultimate user, what we would probably refer to as patient or household pharmaceuticals, okay, for collection, for proper disposal, instead of throwing it away at home or flushing it down the drain. Right? So long-term, what we're allowing in this rule is if your long-term care facility that's a VSQG has one of those DEA allowed on-site collection receptacles, they can put their hazardous waste pharmaceuticals in that receptacle. However, I would caution that DEA only allows the collection receptacles to be used when you're disposing of controlled substances. Those controlled substances must be from an ultimate user. They cannot be for disposing the inventory of controlled substances from long-term care facility or the retail store. Okay, and the 4th and final optional provision for VSQG healthcare facilities is that a long-term care facility with 20 beds or fewer will be presumed to be a VSQG now, and therefore not subject to Subpart P, except the sewer prohibition and the empty container standards. Now, a long-term care facility with more than 20 beds could also be a VSQG, but in that case, the onus is on them to track their monthly hazardous waste generation and demonstrate that they are in fact a VSQG. If you have 20 beds or fewer, you will be presumed to be a VSQG. Okay, so just to wrap up a little bit here, the rule is final. It's effective tomorrow in Iowa, Alaska, Indian Country, and Territories, except for Guam. The sewer ban is effective everywhere tomorrow for all healthcare facilities and reverse distributors, regardless of whether they're VSQGs or not. Okay, so another thing I want to mention is we were not sued on the final rule. I'm very excited to mention that as often and, and to as many people as possible. I'm very happy about that, and it's rare around here. So where do we go from here? We have been very busy, and we just got off of something that we call the FARMS Rule Users Group, and that's a monthly call that we're having on the 3rd Tuesday of every month at 1:30 p.m. So if you are interested in participating in that, that's for states who are going to be implementing the rule. So if you're interested in participating in that, contact us and we can add you to that, that distribution list and join our calls. The next one will be September 17th. We just came from one today. In addition to what we've been doing, we've got a lot more to do. We'll be developing a lot of FAQs for our website and continuing to do training. Hopefully some targeted training, and then we'll also start moving into longer format trainings. Our first one, we prefer to do those in person, but we will consider other venues. Our first one will be in person in New Jersey on October 9th. Starting tomorrow, we hope to put up maps on our website for tracking state adoption of both the Subpart P part of the rule as well as the nicotine listing amendment. As Brian mentioned, nicotine doesn't have to be adopted, Subpart P does, but it's not effective until, in either case, it's not effective until the state does pick it up. So we're going to help you by publishing maps of where we're aware that they have been adopted and where it's effective. And with that, I will leave you with our contact information. If you want to participate in the users group, please contact Brian. And feel free to contact with us with questions that we don't get to today. We can open up for questions now.
Thank you very much, Kristin and Brian. We did have a question that came up about blister packs, which have been dispensed, and whether that's considered RCRA empty.
Yeah, so blister packs, well, let's see if we can find the right page here. It's page 22. I'm gonna go up really fast here and probably give you a headache. Okay, so on that first row, it says stock/dispensing bottles and unit dose containers would be empty if you remove the contents. That the unit dose container would include blister packs.
Okay. Can you repeat the name of the user group?
The Pharmaceuticals Rule Users Group.
Okay, and is it mostly just people who regulate RCRA that participate in that? Is there anyone from Practice Green Health on it?
No, it's meant for state implementers.
And regions.
Yeah.
Okay.
Co-regulators.
Now, I think you may have touched on this. This deals with a long-term care facility. And they indicate, I've received a call, they indicate that they receive pharmaceuticals, but only 30 days, a 30-day supply. And so what happens is the patient uses it up. So if the patient leaves the care or passes away, apparently these pharmaceuticals are still, the part that's not used is still individually wrapped. They have an agreement with their pharmacy to send it back, not as a waste, but as a reusable commodity. Would that be something that would not even be considered a RCRA or a hazardous waste pharmaceutical?
So we covered that on page 42. I'm gonna go back down there, right? So that when I was talking about the offsite consolidation, that was to cover that scenario where long-term care facilities, they get their pharmaceutical supplies from a long-term care pharmacy, and then they can send them back, the ones that aren't used, to the long-term care pharmacy.
Okay.
They're wastes, but we're allowing a VSQG long-term care facility to go ahead and continue. This is a long-standing practice, right?
But, well, they claim it's not a waste, that it's actually reused, or it's resold or repackaged simply because it's a short shelf life.
Yeah, in some cases they do get reshelved, but in most cases they don't. It's kind of.
Well, I was thinking they probably wouldn't be reused because they would be old medications that might exceed a year, but 30 days is pretty short.
Yeah, so it depends upon the cost. So we visit a long-term care pharmacy, and they basically told us, you know, in some cases it's not, the cost of the pill is so small that it's not worth their time to basically pop them out of the blister packs, the unused ones, pop them out of the blister packs and reshelve it and reuse it. Like it's just, it's not cost effective.
Okay, depending on how it's packaged. Okay.
Right, but the thing that goes to a long-term care facility does get repackaged because of Medicare. So that's they get put in blister packs before it gets sent to a long-term care facility, and that comes back that way. So in most of the cases, you know, it depends upon the pill. If it's expensive, then it might be worth their time to repack.
I think they were talking about warfarin, mainly warfarin.
Yeah.
So I don't know how expensive that is.
I don't think it's very expensive anymore. It's, you know, it's generic.
Would they have to document from the pharmacy that it was actually used? Otherwise, it would have to count as a waste? So
this provision is for VSQG long-term care facilities, and this is one of those optional provisions, but the conditions are on the next page. The conditions are, in this case, on the receiving healthcare facility. So the receiving healthcare facility either has to be, if with a long-term care pharmacy, it's going to be the pharmaceutical supplier to the VSQG healthcare facility. They have to be operating under Subpart P and manage all the waste that it receives.
Okay, so the onus would be not on the long-term healthcare facility, but the receiving pharmacy.
Exactly.
The same.
Pretty modest. I mean, the receiving healthcare facility, the conditions there are pretty modest that you can see there on page 43.
You also mentioned this perhaps as well as far as containers. This concerns shampoo that has lindane in it, and apparently these come in 6-ounce doses. They're meant it's meant to be one dose, but sometimes they will only apply part of it. Basically, people have thinner or less hair. So I assume the remaining 2 ounces that they generally may use. Maybe 4 of the 6 ounces. The 2 ounces would be considered a hazardous waste, would need to be counted, or?
Yes. Yeah. Sorry, I'm still stuck on 6 ounces being a single dose. That's a lot of shampoo.
It does seem surprising, but I don't know.
But I guess it's light shampoo, right? So it's not.
Yeah. Right. Correct. So I don't know if you need a hearty dose of that to get rid of the lice or not.
Right. Yeah. So I mean, yeah. If the container's not empty by the new RCRA empty standards for that Brian went over, then whatever is left over would be considered hazardous waste and counted towards their generator status.
So they did ask me about insulin. I don't recall if insulin is a hazardous waste or not.
It can be because of not so much the insulin, it's the preservative that's in it. The M-cresol, it can make it TC.
Oh, okay.
I don't know how common that is, like all forms of insulin, but I know some forms of insulin have M-cresol for preservative.
Oh, okay, so it may or may not be common itself. So I'm wondering, does an episodic event count? If you're VSQG and say like you dump over a bunch of shampoo, now you have to count that. Can you take the provision of an episodic event and keep your VSQG status?
Oh, you're asking some good ones. We actually have some preamble about that. Towards the back of the Federal Register notice. So I haven't read that part of the preamble for a while, but if I recall correctly, if you are a full VSQG, meaning you're not subject to Subpart P, and you have a spill like that, you can take advantage of the episodic generator regulations.
But the 262 regulations.
Right. That's where.
Yeah, the generator improvement rule.
Right, but if you're already subject to Subpart P, you're already subject to Subpart P, so it's not really relevant for your pharmaceuticals.
So it's not really getting you out of anything.
Right. You can still use it for your non-pharmaceuticals, episodic under 262 for your non-pharmaceuticals. Right, but the only place where it would actually be useful is if you're a full VSQG.
So I believe there's a notification requirement. Is it a one-time event? And I'm assuming that's an online notification.
Yeah, I mean, if you use my RCRA ID for filling out your 8700-12, so it's through the 8700-12. It's already been amended. It's updated. It's a one-time notification for Subpart P. I mean, if you're also an LQG and you have to do a banner report, that's essentially re-notification. And if you're also an SQG, for your non-pharmaceuticals, you'll have to do re-notification for your non-pharmaceuticals, right? So the Subpart P portion is one-time notification, but if you generate other waste, you might be re-notifying through other means.
So I assume if you're a VSQG, you're not required to notify, but if you're a VSQG and you think you could be an SQG, then it's better to try to adhere to the Subpart B and do the one-time notification. Yeah.
I mean, I guess sometimes we refer to that as protective filers, right? It's if you're kind of bouncing back and forth, or you're on the edge between VSQG and SQG, I generally recommend just go ahead and over comply. Nobody's going to complain about that, right? You're never going to get in trouble for playing it safe and following the regulations for an SQG, even if you're a VSQG 1 month.
Can I just add real quick? So if you do choose to opt in to Subpart P, then you have to manage your pharmaceutical waste, your hazardous waste pharmaceuticals under Subpart P. So just because you've opted in doesn't mean that you can kind of choose some days to manage it under 262, some days to manage it under Subpart P. Once you're in Subpart P, your pharmaceutical waste is subject to Subpart P.
Yeah, thank you. Good.
Right. I mean, though, there are advantages to be under Subpart P, especially if you anticipate being small or large than 262.
Yeah. So there are advantages to being under Subpart P. Even though it's more stringent, there are some advantages to it too. So, but if you generate more than VSQG amounts of hazardous waste, then you have to operate under Subpart P. It's not universal waste. It's kind of an optional alternative, whereas Subpart P is not optional, right? If you generate above.
Right. Okay. Wanting to know about vape shops, and I don't know. I have not been into a vape shop, so I don't even know. When they sell stuff, whether any of their product goes unused because it's expired, or they have returns from disgruntled customers. But do you anticipate a lot of vape shops, or let me ask you this, maybe, are vape shops obviously aren't healthcare facilities? Are they kind of out of luck and they generate over 1 kilogram? They're going to be a large quantity generator?
So a healthcare facility does include retailers of pharmaceuticals. And
okay, so that might include a vape shop?
It would include a vape shop, yes, which really sounds weird that a vape shop would be considered a healthcare facility. We understand that sounds weird. But as a retailer of a pharmaceutical, they would be considered a healthcare facility and subject to Subpart P if they generate, above VSQG amounts of waste. And nicotine being an acute hazardous waste, they could easily exceed the 2.2 pounds a month.
Now, again, I don't know how common it is, whether vape can remain indefinitely on the shelf and it never expires, or it does expire. I mean, maybe none of them would generate any of that as a waste. But I'm thinking the people who run these shops aren't probably highly educated. So is there any potential outreach materials or a checklist, or these are things to be aware of, you need to be aware of if you're going to be sending off any of this expired or unused or damaged product or waste nicotine material?
Yeah, so we don't have any directed at them yet, but we plan to have some directed guidance. I think a typical retailer, like a convenience store or like a Walmart or CVS or Walgreens or something CVS doesn't sell nicotine products, but Walgreens or Rite Aid, they'll have what's referred to as kind of pre-packaged vaping stuff. So I don't think I don't know that they've got such a waste issue for the pre-packaged stuff. What I think is more of a concern are the vaping shops that mix their own and create their own their own stuff. So FDA refers to them as manufacturers. And they've got some regulations coming down the pike. Well, the FDA regulations have been out for a while. They're just not effective until 2022. But when those regulations become effective, it will make it more difficult for the vape shops to be manufacturers. And so I think that will get phased out over the next few years. But in the meantime, vape shops that mix their own, they'll get nicotine at high concentrations and dilute it down into, vials for their users. And those stores probably do have high concentrations of nicotine possibly getting disposed of. So that's probably more of a concern than kind of the retailers that are selling the prepackaged stuff.
Okay. I did see a chat about the list of pharmaceuticals I believe Florida had a fairly lengthy list. I don't know if any of that is outdated stuff, but wouldn't that be a good starting point if you were trying to at least, maybe you're not getting 100% of the universe, but you're getting maybe 90% of the universe by going with the Florida list, or maybe even a smaller list, which would be what is posted on the HERC website. But wouldn't they be a good starting point if you were looking at a way of trying to help a potential pharmacy try to identify potentially hazardous waste pharmaceuticals?
Yeah, Brian and I just brought up the slide there. The last bullet was Florida's, and they just updated it relatively recently. So I like Florida's. Colorado's got a good list. HERC has a decent list, or Wiki. So I kind of recommend people look at multiple lists and kind of cross reference them.
But I think the main point to just keep in mind is that just because something isn't on one of these lists doesn't mean that it's not a hazardous waste pharmaceutical.
Right. It's just it's not going to be as common or frequently used.
It's a good start, but I wouldn't maybe rely on them exclusively to be compliant.
So another chat was a VSQG. A full VSQG is only subject to the sewer ban and also the container empty or defining an empty container.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Oh, okay.
And then they can use the optional provisions if they want that are in 266-504, or they can choose to opt into full Subpart P if they want for their hazardous waste pharmaceuticals. So, the reason somebody might choose to do that is if, they're a national organization, national retail chain, for example, and some stores are VSQGs and some aren't, and they just want to create one national program for everybody, they might choose to opt in their VSQGs into Subpart P.
Yeah, in Indiana, it seemed like there was a lot of CVS stores that opted in or have expressed that they are large quantity generators of hazardous waste. And ironically, I found that there was maybe but 2 Walgreens stores. And it's not because there's no Walgreens. There's probably as many of them as there are CVS stores.
Yeah, so CVS has told us that the primary reason their stores are LQGs is because of nicotine patches, gums, and lozenges. So once states adopt the nicotine listing amendment, most of the CVSs will not be LQGs anymore. Okay,
they'll fall out. They'll be VSQGs then.
Right. That's what they've told us, is that the large majority of their stores are only LQGs because of nicotine patches, gums, and lozenges. They don't sell any other nicotine products. They don't have the vaping stuff.
Now, I'm wondering, on the sewer ban, are you going to be working with your wastewater folk to try to get the word out so that a POTW can ask questions of any given business that they think might have hazardous pharmaceuticals that might be tempted?
Office of Water has worked with us to develop the FAQs that we just posted on our website. I think they went live last week. So we worked.
Oh, okay.
We worked with them, and the pre-treatment coordinators generated a lot of the questions that we included on those FAQs.
Okay. Well, we've gone over, and I appreciate both of you for staying longer and sharing with us your knowledge and experience, and hopefully whatever training or guidance documents, or if you're going to be in one of our states, hopefully we have an opportunity to continue on. It's especially helpful to have something we can take with us if we go out to a facility. Honestly, though, I've been to hospitals, but not because of their pharmaceuticals, but generally because they have combustion activities and they might need an air permit. That's about it. Anyone else have questions or comments? Nancy, do you have any parting words of wisdom?
No, sir, I don't, other than I have recorded this and we will put it on the technical subcommittee page on the National SBEEP site.
I thank you very much. And I thank you, Brian and Kristin.
Thank you.
Thank you.